My name is Mary McCabe. I'm a member of the 1820 Society, which was set up many years ago to keep alive the memory of the radical wars of the early 19th century, which led up to the uprising of 1820. I'm at the gates here of Sighthill Cemetery, which is on Springburn Road, and that's A803 in Glasgow. And we're going to walk up that hill there, that path, to see a monument which was erected in conditions of secrecy in 1847, and some would say it's shrouded in secrecy to this day. This period of our history has been neglected from the start and suppressed. We want to hear about it now. So, this is the monument. It's a listed building, it's a handsome monument, but why is it that the people in the surrounding streets mostly have no idea at all of its existence? Well, when we talk about Red Clydeside, most people mean the early 20th century. But actually 100 years before that, in the early 19th century, Clydeside in the west of Scotland was a total hotbed of political and economic revolution. The main centres of trouble and unrest pinpointed by the authorities might actually surprise you. I'm going to read out some of the names. All these radical places: Mulgai, Balfron, Kirkintilloch, Kilsyth, Condorit, Rutherglen, Elderslie, Johnson, Straven, Kilbarchan, Neilston, Eaglesham, Dorrye, Stewarton, Stirling and Falkirk. These are all places outside Glasgow. Within what's now the city centre, the city boundary, we had Germiston, Anderson, Cumlachie, Carlton, Bridgeton, Pollokshaws and Dalmarnock. And the weaving town of Paisley is very proud that the riot act was read in that town more than anywhere else, and it had fierce competition. So I mentioned the weavers. The unrest was led by the weavers. The weavers were always the centre of that kind of thing because they were relatively independent, more or less self-employed, and their wages were negotiated by free collective bargaining with the magistrates. But their wages had been cut illegally by 50%. So they were leading the unrest, and in fact, at this time the population of Glasgow was something, well, in 1811, when there was a count made, it was 110,400 or something like that. Yet, in the whole of West Central Scotland, 100,000 people risked transportation or death to join illegal trade unions. The villages, what were they doing in these villages? Well, they all had a lending library where they lent out books, very often banned books, because a whole lot of books were banned. They also had reform societies where they discussed issues of the day. They planned uprisings. They bought and sold gunpowder, made pikes, planning for some revolution in the future. They did paramilitary training in their local parks, including Glasgow Green. The band song Scots Wha Hae. When Burns wrote Scots Wha Hae, it was immediately banned by the authorities, and it was banned for 50 years. But it became a revolutionary symbol, not just in Scotland, which might surprise you, but in England and Ireland as well. And so you would get bands in the street just even playing the tune, and they were immediately arrested for sedition. So that was what was going on. The authorities, of course, hit back. They deployed soldiers in all these trouble spots, and they also infiltrated the reform societies with spies and agents provocateurs. The agents, the government agents, their role was to try to rouse up the people to more direct military action so as to flush out the leaders, to make the leaders put their heads over the parapets. So that's what they were doing. And unlikely members of the establishment that you wouldn't think would be involved in that at all. The editor of the Glasgow Herald and Walter Scott, the novelist, both, and other people too like them, set up personal private militias, some of them with uniforms, wee bands of soldiers to support the government against the radicals. Now, things came to a head in March the 21st, 1820, when a committee met in a pub in Gallowgate in Glasgow, and they discussed setting up a provisional government. We know what their aims are because, of course, the whole committee was infiltrated with government spies who reported back. Their aims were not just economic, but they were political as well. They wanted better conditions for the working classes. They wanted the weavers' illegally cut wages to be restored. But they also wanted the universal male franchise. Now, at this point in England, throughout England, only 4% of the people had the vote. In Scotland, it was worse. In Scotland, it was 0.2% of the population who were allowed to vote. And Scotland was very badly underrepresented. The whole of Scotland had fewer MPs than Cornwall. Glasgow had no MPs at all, whereas Liverpool, that was tiny compared to Glasgow at that time, had 2 MPs. So they wanted better representation, both as individual voters, but also for Scotland generally. And they wanted independence for Scotland. We know this because the police spy John Mitchell, who was with them, reported back, and I quote his words, about their audacious plot to sever the Kingdom of Scotland from that of England and restore the ancient Scottish Parliament. So the political aims were probably why they were generally treated more harshly and, of course, much less famous, and the whole story suppressed down the ages, than the likes of the Tolpuddle martyrs, who were really just wanting to form unions and swear oaths to each other. Nothing political, it was all about their economic situation. So the authorities hit back. The soldiers were deployed all over Glasgow. They put them in Gallowgate, Eglinton Street, St Tina Square, St Vincent Street, and they deployed artillery on all the Clyde bridges. And they sent for more hussars and soldiers out of England to come up. Now, oh yes, I forgot to mention, the committee, as soon as they came out of that pub, they were all arrested, and we don't hear any more about them, but you can take it nothing very good happened to them. But yet, in their names, a whole lot of leaflets, pamphlets and posters went round all the villages, urging people to come out and strike on April the 1st and to join an armed revolution on April the 5th. So April the 1st came, and 60,000 people come out and strike, which horrified the authorities. They'd never expected their little ploy to be so successful. And then, on April the 4th, a man called Andrew Hardy, who was a former soldier, was persuaded, against his better judgment, to head off with a band of men to the Carn Iron Works to get metal which they could melt down and forge weapons for this coming revolution. Now, the reason it was against his better judgment was that far fewer people turned out than what they'd expected for this big revolution that was happening, and he was not wanting to go at all. But a man called John King, well no, it was actually Duncan Lees, this one was called, another government agent, urged him to go on and march to Condorit, where he'd meet far more revolutionaries out at Condorit, led by a man called John Baird. And Duncan, of course, by the way, would have gone with them, except that he had to start a revolution somewhere else, so, you know, my wishes go with you, and off he went. So Andrew Hardy marched from more or less the necropolis in Glasgow, along what we'd now call, Royston Road, along Germiston. He walked from Germiston with his band of men, there was only about 30 of them, had actually turned up and stayed with it, even when they saw how few there were. Walked to Condorit and met with John Baird. John Baird, meanwhile, had his own band of men, but was expecting a whole crowd to come along with Andrew Hardy. When the two leaders saw how few there were, they wanted to call the whole thing off. But government agent stepped in, one that was with John Baird, called John King. He said, no, this is the way they always did it. They always said, there are more revolutionaries over that next hill, round that bend, in the next village. Come on, we've just got a few more steps to go and we'll get there. So they walked all night, in fact, till they came to Bonnymuir, which is close to Falkirk. And they rested in a field there. And John King said, I'm going to go and bring the other revolutionaries to join you. And of course what he came back with was a big band of soldiers on horseback cavalry. Well, the radicals were militia trained. Most of them were ex-soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars, and they'd also done militia training, illegal paramilitary training and so on. So they formed themselves into a square, which is what infantry are supposed to do apparently when they've got a whole horde of cavalry riding down on them, because the idea is that the horses get spooked by the shape of a square. That's the theory anyway, but it didn't work in practice. So they went and they took refuge behind a dike which is still in the field. It's known as the Radical Dyke to this day. So this dike is in the field, and they took cover behind it while they fired on the soldiers. But they were overwhelmed by numbers, and the ones that didn't manage to run away got captured and taken away to various prisons all over Scotland. So that was all happening on the night of April the 4th to the 5th. The very next day, unfortunately no emails or mobile phones or anything like that in those days, so there was a man in Straven called James Wilson, and he was quite an interesting man. He was older than the others. He was 63. He was known as James Purley Wilson. He was a hosier, a weaver, and he was the inventor of pearl knitting. But he also turned his hand to a whole lot of different trades. He also wrote satirical verse against all the politicians of the time. And in previous periods of unrest, he'd gone in peaceful demonstrations carrying a banner which said, Scotland free or a desert. But of more significance to the authorities was the fact that his house was a rendezvous point for all the radicals in all the villages around to come regularly and meet and discuss political issues. Not just stuff that affected them directly, like the wages of the weavers, but also stuff of what we'd call global concerns. The abolition of slavery, the abolition of the Corn Laws, all these things are discussed about. So the authorities definitely had James Wilson in their sights. So he was advised, against his better judgment yet again, by another government agent to march with 25 men towards Cathkin, where he was told there would be 7,000 people, 7,000 revolutionaries waiting to start up this thing. But before they got to Cathkin, they only got as far as East Kilbride, and then they realised they'd been duped. So they turned back without firing a shot, without anything, and went back home, went into their homes. But they were now pinpointed, they were now identified by the authorities. So the soldiers came and smashed into their homes and grabbed them in their homes, took 10 of them away, including James Wilson. And over that whole period in West Central Scotland, 88 men were charged with high treason. Now, just a wee word about high treason. High treason was never codified properly into Scots law. It was just lifted wholesale from English law, and there was actually quite an argument about it at the time of the Treaty of Union. It was taken from English law and put into Scots law, but they'd never really tried anybody in Scotland on it. At previous rebellions, like the Jacobite rebellions, everybody that was going to be done for high treason was taken down to England to be tried. But on this occasion they said they would do it differently. They would try them under English law, and they would bring up English lawyers to actually prosecute them, and that's what they did. In secret courts, the judges made it clear that everything had to be secret in these courts, nobody saying anything about it. Now, while all these people were scattered in jails all over the Central Belt, making it very difficult for the family to meet them and to visit them or anything, the mobs in the street were fighting with all the soldiers, trying to free these men from jail. And in Greenock, in fact, they succeeded. In Greenock, they managed to spring 5 political prisoners out of Greenock jail, the crowds throwing stones at soldiers. But it was at great cost to themselves, because the soldiers fired indiscriminately into the crowds, and they killed 8 people, including a wee boy of 8, and they seriously injured 10 people. An old woman lost a leg through it, so it was that kind of injury. So eventually came the trials, and they were not trials as we think of them. They lasted usually about 14 hours. They started at 10 in the morning. You could go through to the small hours of the next day without a break. And when it was dark, only the judge had a candle. But that was okay, because they weren't allowed to write notes anyway. And it must have been actually quite boring, not for those obviously in the dock whose lives were in the stake, but for jurors, for instance. How would you stay awake? 14 hours, a lot of it in the dark, and the speeches took hours on end. Reading out the charges against James Wilson took 2 hours, because they read out every banned leaflet that he'd ever supposed to have read. And to give you an idea of the revolutionary, scurrilous literature he was reading, one of them was the Manchester Guardian. So the verdicts, the juries were very reluctant to return a guilty verdict. They kept coming back with not guilty. There was plea bargaining. The judges would send them back again and again, really angrily saying, get it right this time, guilty, guilty, how hard is that, and sending them backwards and forwards. At the very end, they found James Wilson, Andrew Hardy and John Baird guilty of high treason, but they put in a plea of clemency, mercy, for James Wilson, because he'd not even fired a shot. He'd done nothing really except march up and down with a band of men, and he was an old man and known to be peaceable and all the rest of it. But the judge ignored the plea for clemency. So the 3 of them were sentenced. Now, the English penalty for high treason, and that was what all the men in the dock thought they were facing if they got found guilty, was hanging, drawn and quartering, with all the disembowelment and so on that involves, for a man. For a woman, by the way, it's burning at the stake. There weren't any women here just now, but I thought I'd just mention that. So what they said they'd do is they would water down the penalty, and they'd just hang them and then cut off the heads once they were dead. The hangman, the regular hangman, refused to do such a bizarre punishment, so they hired a medical student from Glasgow University who said he'd done that kind of thing in anatomy classes. So they said he could cut off the heads, and they paid him double what the normal hangman got. His name was Thomas Moore. So he cut off. James Wilson made a passionate speech of 250 words all about his cause, but the judge interrupted it, of course, again and again, and told the reporters to show discrimination in what they report. So the Glasgow Herald next day said he stammered forth a few words in an incoherent fashion. That was how they put it. So anyway, James Wilson got his head cut off by the student on Glasgow Green in front of a crowd, an angry, sullen crowd of 20,000 people. In those days, think of it, 20,000 people gathered to see it, and they were hissing at the soldiers, they were shouting, they were really, really aggressive towards the soldiers, and the soldiers were holding them back with guns and bayonets. And after they cut off James Wilson's head, the student went up to Stirling and did the same for Baird and Hardy. After which, he was an extremely unpopular man, and in fact he had to leave not just the town but the country. He fled to Ireland to give up his studies. He couldn't go on living in Scotland, so that was the end of him. But you can actually see the mask, the axe and the cloak which he wore, the very items he wore, are still on display in the Smith Museum, which is in Stirling, so you know they're still there if you want to have a look at them. Now the rest of the folk, of course, again quite a lot of people got off. The juries refused to find some of them guilty, others got plea bargained down a bit. Some of them were government agents who of course were maybe given a light fine and the government paid for it. But in the end there were 19 who were done for high treason but had their sentences commuted from death to transportation to Australia. And while they were in jail, you know, for months waiting for a ship to take them, some of them wrote poems and ballads about their situation. And one man called Alan Murchie wrote quite a lot of poems. We think he wrote a ballad called Dark Bonnie Muir, which is quite a long ballad. But here we've got Alan Dixon is going to sing us a verse of it.
On the 5th day of April, 1820, the great Beard and Hardy did march from their home. To guard the freedom home's rights, peace and plenty, but tyranny conquered and gave them a tomb. Like traitors they died on the 8th of September, in the cold silent grave they were consigned to slumber. But heaven will avenge them, let tyrants remember, and raise up new heroes on dark Bonnie Muir.
In 1832, a reform bill was passed which gave the vote to 60,000 Scottish men, which was 13% of the male population. And Andrew Hardy's mother on that occasion put a wee card in her window saying, "Britons rejoice, reform is won, but 'twas the cause lost me my son." Now this monument, in 1847 they at last got permission to erect a monument to the martyrs, and this is Sighthill Cemetery of course now, which is the property of Glasgow City Council. But in those days it was private ground and it was owned by a supporter of the reformists. So they got his permission to erect this monument in 1847 and to bury the bodies, to go to Stirling and bury the bodies, rebury the bodies of Beard and Hardy under it. But the authorities were very, very clear about how they should do that, and in fact the conditions they should do it on are actually written on the monument. It says, "The removal shall take place without any public notice or intimation and without any procession or concourse or attendance of people, but in the presence of a few friends only." So it to be in the dark and the secret by night and everything. So these few friends went to Stirling with the help of an old man with a long memory. They finally located the graves, the unmarked graves of Beard and Hardy, and they identified them by Baird's smashed jaw because his head was all smashed. The student had botched the job, he wasn't very good at beheading. So they took them away and they buried them under here, and a few years later one of the few transportees who returned to Scotland from Australia, a man called Andrew White, when he died naturally here in the Royal Infirmary, he asked to be buried here also alongside his comrades. So he's the third radical who's buried here, Andrew White. On the southern side there's a poem written in the kind of flowery style of the time. It's quite quite a long poem, but I'll read you just the first few verses, the first few lines of it. Well, it says it's for John Baird and Andrew Hardy, who for the cause of freedom suffered death at Stirling. And then it says, "Here lie the slain and mutilated forms of those who fell, and fell like martyrs true. Faithful to freedom through a time of storms, they met their fate as patriots always do, despising death, which ne'er can noble souls subdue. Calmly they viewed death's dread and dark array, then heaven directed, turned their prayerful eyes, serene in the hope they triumphed o'er dismay. Their country's wrongs alone drew forth their sighs." And on the eastern side, on the side, in fact, beside that, there's a mention of James Wilson, who is buried now. He was reburied by his family in the family lair at Straven, so that's where he lies. The Glasgow City Council, from time to time, has had a slightly ambivalent, well, City Council, District Council, Corporation, it's changed its name through all the local government reconstructions, but they've had a kind of sometimes ambivalent attitude towards this monument. When the 1820 Society have their ceremonies here, the council very often, quite often, send a representative to do a wee speech as well. But, well, you've got to remember at the very beginning, actually, who was calling in all these soldiers? It was actually the provost of the time and the sheriff, all the authorities of Glasgow at that time. And in 1990, Glasgow City Council actually claimed that Baird and Hardy were not buried under there, and in fact the 1820 Society had to dig them up to show they were. After that, the Glasgow District Council allowed the 1820 Society to add a plaque naming the 19 transportees. So they're all now named on the monument. And in fact, at the Battle of Bonnymuir, also again recently, the 1820 Society got permission to put a wee stone and plaque marking that, because there was nothing to show the field of Bonnymuir. It just looked like a farmer's field with a lump of stone in the middle of it. It was a radical. So, but still these events are shrouded in secrecy. We would know nothing about them if it weren't for the man who's buried nearby here. Seamus McAgovin, he was a historian who, along with Peter Beres Fidelis, he did all the research into this hidden history, and he produced this book, The Scottish Insurrection of 1820. He published this, they published this in 1970. And in fact, on Seamus's grave, he was a Gaelic scholar, so there's a Gaelic inscription. Seamus McAgovin, Echtreiche Uchker is jealousach Guhari mun Vliena, 1820. Historian, activist, and 1820 author. In 2001, the newly reconstituted Scottish Parliament had a debate about whether the story of the radical wars that had been all over central Scotland, you know, over a large part of Scotland, involved hundreds, thousands of people in one way or another, and the 1820 Rising, whether they should form part of the history, be included in the history curriculum in schools. But there were still voices who thought this was a step too far, it was dangerous information. There was one MSP in particular who said that he had in the past sometimes argued that they should teach some Scottish history in Scottish schools, but not this bit, this bit was, you know, no, definitely this bit should be totally forgotten. But still, every year, on the anniversary of the execution of Baird and Hardy, the 1820 Society commemorate the sacrifice that the martyrs made in the cause of political reform. We should not forget them.